wait another minute, no, I won't. I'm a man on a mission. I'm a man on a mission. I don't need no permission. I'm a man on a mission. Take it up now, take it up. I ain't waiting and wishing. Take it up now, take it up. Oh, I got that ambition. Take it up now, take it up. I'm a man on a mission. Won't wait another minute, no, I won't. I won't wait another minute, no, I won't. I won't wait another minute, no, I won't, yeah. I won't wait another minute, no, I won't. I'm a man on a mission. I'm a man on a mission. I don't need no permission. I'm a man on a mission. Take it up now, take it up. I ain't waiting and wishing. Take it up now, take it up. Oh, I got that ambition. Take it up now, take it up. I'm a man on a mission. Take it up now, take it up. Take it up now, take it up. Take it up now, take it up. I'm a man on a mission. Take it up now, take it up. Take it up now, take it up. Take it up now, take it up. I'm a man on a mission.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the webinar on Sri Lanka's unexplored wilderness. This is the 7th online lecture which the Wildlife Society of S.Thomas College, Mount Lavinia has conducted so far. These online webinars are done with the aim of increasing public awareness on Sri Lanka's unique flora and fauna, as we believe that awareness is vital in the path of conservation. And this webinar in particular spotlights the vast yet poorly traversed and rapidly diminishing wilderness areas in our beautiful motherland. The Wildlife Society of St. Thomas's College, Mount Lavinia is one of the oldest natural history societies in the country. Founded in 1884, our society has empowered great naturalists, scientists, and conservationists for over 136 years. I would like to say that today we are extremely honored and delighted to present to you Mr. John Wilson. Mr. John Wilson is a wildlife conservationist and freelance field guide with years of experience traversing the wilds of Sri Lanka. He is a permanent representative of the Rainforest Protectors Trust, executive committee member of Reforest Sri Lanka, and director of Rainforest Rescue International, working closely with both the Department of Wildlife Conservation and the Department of Forest Conservation. Mr. John specializes in studying the contiguous vegetation cover and the overall extent of the protected area network on our island. Through his work, he has helped to both conserve and raise much needed awareness on the vital yet rapidly diminishing wilderness areas in Sri Lanka. We would now like to sincerely thank Jeep and Demo Sri Lanka for sponsoring this webinar. We are grateful for their generous contribution to make these online lectures possible. If you have any questions that you would like to be answered by Mr. Wilson regarding the topic, please direct them to Jonathan Bulat-Sinhala, who is the host. I will now hand over to Mr. John Wilson. Mr. John, over to you.
Thank you very much, Imet. Thank you very much to the Wildlife Society of St. Thomas's College, and thank you to everybody who turned out today. It's been quite an amazing turnout. So thank you for turning out to for this Zoom webinar on unexplored wildernesses on this fantastic island of ours that we call home. So I'm going to kick this off with a little PowerPoint presentation, which I'm going to share. And this is more just to give everybody who has joined in today a brief understanding of what we mean when we talk about the unexplored wildernesses, as well as the overall context for wilderness areas in Sri Lanka. Now, I know between MV Express Pearl, the recent maritime disaster, between the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, and the multitude of other issues facing the island recently, we've had quite a bit of trouble in the ecological sphere. And this has led to quite a bit of confusion amongst many members of the general public who are struggling to figure out what exactly is going on with Sri Lanka's wilderness areas and how does it relate to us. So The first thing I'm going to do is start with the presentation, as I said. Jonathan, Imit, can you all both see my screen?
Yeah, John, perfect.
Yeah, perfect. All right. So I'm going to start this off by just asking a very brief question as such. So the image on your screen. Now, I will come back to this later, but I just want people to think, where could this be, an image of this nature? On my left-hand side, we have a female elephant with a very young calf, and to her right, a slightly older female. And on the right-hand side image, we have an enormous bull elephant, plus another young female as well. So I just want to put the thought in everybody's head. Where could an image like this have been taken when we're talking about wilderness areas in Sri Lanka? I just want everybody to think about it, and I'll come back to it later. But this image, when I reveal where this was taken, I think that's when people will start to understand just how important the connectivity and the overall nature of wilderness areas in Sri Lanka is. So before we start, I just want people to understand, and I just want to make this clear. Wilderness areas in Sri Lanka fall under three distinct categories. The first is Sri Lanka's protected areas. Protected areas form the core of Sri Lanka's wilderness areas. But aside from protected areas, we also have unprotected wildernesses, or wildernesses that only receive partial or semi-protection under the existing legislative framework. And those fall under two categories, namely other state forests and state forested lands. Now, there are further subcategories, but I will get into that as we go through the presentation. So the first thing we're going to go through is the protected areas themselves. So what is a protected area, and why is it important to me? And what does it mean for Sri Lanka's ecology when we have protected areas? So a protected area is a clearly defined geographical space which is usually recognized and managed through legal or other effective means. More and more these days, that has come to mean community-based conservation initiatives to achieve the long-term conservation of nature and associated ecosystem services and cultural values. This is the IUCN definition as per the World Commission on Protected Areas. However, associated ecosystem services and cultural values is of quite significant importance, because protected areas, although in the most traditional sense, are there for the purposes of preserving ecology, in a less traditional sense, protected areas in Sri Lanka concern themselves with archaeological, historical, and cultural aspects as well. And you'll see what I mean as we go through. So obviously protected areas in Sri Lanka are fall within quite a complicated bureaucratic frame. There's a number of cabinet ministries, state ministries, and government entities that have purview of the various protected area types in Sri Lanka. Today, I'm not going to go into that. That's a discussion for another time. But I'm just going to briefly show you what these are, just so you have an idea as to what the bureaucratic and legal backing behind protected areas in Sri Lanka is. Because without understanding that, it's very difficult to actually engage in comprehensive, cohesive protected area management and plan implementation. So these two slides basically concern that. But again, at the end of the day, the protected area network, despite falling under such a complicated bureaucratic framework, it still forms the ecological heart of what Sri Lanka has to offer. So the first one, and I guess the most obvious one for a lot of people here, will be the Department of Wildlife Conservation. Now, the protected areas listed out here are those that fall under the Department of Wildlife Conservation. For many of you, national parks will be the most relevant, because national parks in Sri Lanka are the most well-known protected areas, since they are, number one, publicly accessible to the general public, number two, form the backbone of Sri Lanka's ecotourism earnings, and number three, due to the continuous visitation that many national parks have received in Sri Lanka, they very much form that core identity of what protected areas are. On this island, we have 27 national parks at the moment. We do have one that is in the process of being gazetted, but of course that process is still ongoing. So recognizing that as a national park isn't quite in our capacity to do so as of yet. But even for the DWC, it's not just about national parks. We also have strict nature reserves, wildlife sanctuaries, corridors. As I've listed out here, there are 4 distinct corridor types that are recognized. We even have protected area buffer zones to a limited extent. Managed elephant reserves, the very first of which was actually declared earlier this year in Hambantota. A multitude of marine protected areas, including sea mammal observation zones. So depending on who has joined today, some of you might have engaged in cetacean watching, basically going on a marine safari to watch whales and dolphins. The majority who have gone on such marine safaris will have no doubt gone from Mirissa. And Mirissa, or the coastal waters of Mirissa, are one example of a sea mammal observation zone. So even amongst the Department of Wildlife Conservation's protected areas, although, as I said, national parks form the core of it, there are other protected areas which are of equal, if not more importance. Now, in the case of strict nature reserves, for example, strict nature reserves actually are there specifically for the purposes of ecological preservation. Entry into strict nature reserves is completely prohibited, and even to engage in scientifically oriented research work, you need minimum 6 to 8 months worth of documentation. And then once you do receive permission to enter a strict nature reserve by the Department of Wildlife Conservation, you'll usually be accompanied by 2 or 3 wildlife officers in order to ensure that you behave in accordance with the standards set under the Flora and Fauna Protection Ordinance. Wildlife sanctuaries, they're a bit more non-linear in that sense. Wildlife sanctuaries in Sri Lanka are an interesting area because they actually cover not just state land, but elements of private land as well. So the way a wildlife sanctuary works is unlike, again, a more traditional protected area type where the state is in full control of the land. Wildlife sanctuaries in Sri Lanka can also include private lands if gazetted as such. A wildlife sanctuary could be entirely state land, but for the most part, wildlife sanctuaries are actually used to include certain areas of private land. And the reason why private land is usually incorporated in the peripheries or in certain parts of wildlife sanctuaries is to actually provide protection to flora and fauna that are found otherwise outside the traditional protected area network. In contrast to that, nature reserves, much like their strict nature reserve counterparts, are very much state land owned. But unlike strict nature reserves don't have such stringent requirements for entry. Obviously, at the moment, none of the nature reserves that we have, and we have 9 nature reserves present in Sri Lanka at the moment, none of those 9 nature reserves are open to the general public at the moment. But again, that's a discussion that I'm sure will slowly evolve over time as we move into a very, very fundamentally important decade of biodiversity conservation between 2020 and 2030. Then, as far as corridors, now, although the Department of Wildlife Conservation has identified a multitude, I believe about 16 were identified in the last audit report that was conducted by on the Department of Wildlife Conservation's conservation-related activities. Only 2 have actually ever been gazetted. So the first one that's been gazetted would be the Nelugala Forest Corridor, which historically was supposed to provide a linkage between Madhuroya National Park and Galloya Valley National Park. That was gazetted quite a while ago, but its current status remains relatively unclear because although Nelugala was gazetted, there isn't much to suggest that there is much remaining of Nelugala. Nelugala was actually a byproduct of the protected area management programs that emerged when the Mahaveli development scheme took place. And during that accelerated Mahaveli development scheme, vast areas of the country were cleared for the purposes of development, cultivation, and human settlement. So as a result, in response, a number of protected areas were set aside for the purposes of preserving ecological diversity in the Mahaveli region and to the south towards the Galloya Valley region. And then the second one, of course, is the Mineria Kaudala Wild Elephant Corridor. And that basically forms a contiguous link between Mineria National Park and Kaudala National Park which are two national parks that are very, I'm sure for a lot of you, are very much places you would consider home, in the sense that the great elephant gathering of Asia is seen in significant capacity in Caudala National Park and Minnere National Park during the months of the gathering itself. So that's the Department of Wildlife Conservation. That's a government department that many of you will be aware and many of you will know. I'm sure a lot of you will have fond memories of staying inside Department of Wildlife Conservation protected areas, whether it's in circuit bungalows, whether it's staying outside in the immediate periphery and coming inside and going on safari. For a lot of you, that will be very familiar. But the Department of Wildlife Conservation isn't the only government entity that handles protected areas in Sri Lanka. Now, just for reference, I'm just going to leave this here while I lead on to the next government entity, because I think it's important that we understand what the largest protected areas in Sri Lanka are, because that size component is quite important for Sri Lanka. We're not a large country. We don't have millions and millions of square kilometers worth of land that we can preserve, conserve, and use for the purposes of ecological stability. We're not an African country. We're not India. We don't have that type of landmass. And yet, despite that, we still manage to get protected areas of significant size, which to me is quite amazing, because despite a multitude of anthropogenic pressures, not to mention that we have over 20 million people, 20 million fellow citizens inhabiting this island, we still have set aside significant areas for the purposes of ecological preservation. So these are the largest protected areas, specifically under the Department of Wildlife Conservation. And what you'll notice is that not all of them are national parks. Many of the more recently declared marine wildlife sanctuaries are enormous in extent. And that's important because Sri Lanka's marine protected area network has historically been underwhelming, to say the least. And I think more and more recognition recently, especially in the aftermath of the MV Express Pearl maritime tragedy, has given light to the fact that we have not given enough significance to the overall marine environment in Sri Lanka, which is true. We haven't, because traditionally, from the most traditional interpretation of protected areas, we have always focused on the terrestrial and avian sphere. But it is good to know that we are slowly moving towards a bit more of a balance. We have a long way to go, make no mistake, but we are slowly moving towards a balance in terms of what protected areas are there in the marine sphere as well. So this was just for reference more than anything, but let's move on. The next government entity that some of you will be familiar with is the Department of Forest Conservation. Now, the Department of Forest Conservation is a tricky one. You see, because their mandate right up until about 7-8 years ago was simply as the Forest Department. They only became the Department of Forest Conservation roughly in 2013. And that was a few years after their piece of parliamentary legislation, the Forest Conservation Ordinance, was amended to become the Forest Conservation Ordinance in 2009. So the Department of Forest Conservation now very much matches the mandate of the Department of Wildlife Conservation, but they match it, and yet they operate in their own sphere and their own capacity. But their protected areas are actually what are most fundamentally important to ensure that we have a protected area network that is ecologically stable. What do I mean by that? Well, for a start, approximately 60+%, just over 60%, of Sri Lanka's total protected area network falls under the Department of Forest Conservation, not the Department of Wildlife Conservation. And this is a fact that I think has eluded a lot of people for quite some time. Now, the Department of Forest Conservation still has a secondary mandate that is oriented towards monoculture, silviculture, analog forestry, and other sustainable forestry types and products. That hasn't changed. But their primary mandate now is the preservation of their protected area. So much like the strict nature reserves of the Department of Wildlife Conservation, equaling on a tier in that sense are the Department of Forest Conservation's conservation forests. Now, conservation forests, again, traditionally would be completely off limits to the general public. And for the most part, they are. But unlike the Flora and Fauna Protection Ordinance, the Forest Conservation Ordinance isn't actually as stringent as its flora and fauna counterpart. So this means that certain conservation forests, under the strict supervision of the Conservator General of Forests, basically the man at the top of the Department of Forest Conservation, can actually be open for the purposes of ecotourism. And the most well-known conservation forest, or at least it's known because of its fantastic scenery, its incredible ecological diversity, and the aesthetic value, not to mention the watershed protection that it provides. Many of you might not know it as a conservation forest, but it is, and that is the Knuckles Conservation Forest. And the Knuckles Conservation Forest, I'll show you this later on Google Earth, but the Knuckles Conservation Forest is one of the most important protected areas under the Department of Forest Conservation. Now, obviously, the Department of Forest Conservation's protected areas don't necessarily follow the traditional sphere of the Department of Wildlife Conservation's protected areas, because unlike going on a vehicular safari, in a protected area like the Knuckles Conservation Forest, you actually go on a walking or a hiking safari, depending on which definition you take. Then, of course, we have the National Heritage Wilderness areas. Now, National Heritage Wilderness areas are actually a special circumstance because they actually have their own piece of parliamentary legislation as protected areas, and any government entity's protected areas can be declared as National Heritage Wilderness areas. So they're supposed to be a sphere above the rest, as it were. But at the moment, only one protected area in Sri Lanka's history was ever declared as a National Heritage Wilderness area, and that is Singaraja. Now, Singaraja, although being declared as a National Heritage Wilderness area, the primary protected area component of Sri Lanka, of Singaraja, shall we say, is that of it being a reserved forest, a national reserve forest. Now, the Singaraja Reserved Forest, again, is one of the most fundamentally important wilderness areas in the wet zone of Sri Lanka. Many of you will know Singaraja from its vivid avian fauna, its incredible reptilian and amphibian diversity, its stunning views, its ancient lowland tropical and submontane rainforests. But more than that, Singaraja represents a protected area component that if we lose, we will lose part of our ecological identity in Sri Lanka. Singaraja is a living laboratory. In fact, many of the protected areas in the wet zone are. You see, because unlike the dry zone, where protected areas are usually known for their charismatic fauna, their megafauna, including the terrestrial big five, although there are elements of the terrestrial big five in our wet zone protected areas, the wet zone protected areas very much are still the ecological heart of Sri Lanka, more than anything. So between Knuckles and Singaraja, and there are other examples of this. Horton Plains National Park is a beautiful option, which is again, very different in terms of wet zone protected areas, but it in itself, given its high density of Sri Lankan leopards, forms its own unique aspect of the overall protected area network within the wet zone. You have the Peak Wilderness Wildlife Sanctuary, a biodiversity hotspot that we still don't fully understand. Because there's been very little research that's actually been done on the full extent of Peak Wilderness's ecological treasures. So again, it's important to remember that a lot of these conservation forests, national reserve forests, the National Heritage Wilderness Area, that is Singaraja, the forest corridors that have been gazetted under the Department of Forest Conservation, the National Forest Reserves, a lot of these are in the wet zone. Not all of them, but a significant percentage are. And the reason why I keep referring back to the wet zone is because that ecological uniqueness is what defines the wet zone. Our wet zone is on par with the great rainforests of the Congo, of the Amazon, and of Southeast Asia in terms of ecological diversity. And it's such a shame today that we have such little of it left. But there is hope still. In 2019, Singaraja was quadrupled in size. And as a protected area, that will hopefully provide a model for all future conservation efforts where protected areas in the wet zone are concerned. And then there's an interesting one after national forest reserves, and that's the ecological or eco parks. Now, that's a very recent concept. The Department of Forest Conservation basically attempted to try and mirror the Department of Wildlife Conservation. And as such, although they're not recognized internationally as a protected area type, one thing to keep in mind is that countries don't necessarily follow the international standards set by the World Commission on Protected Areas and by IUCN. They can, but what they can also do is introduce their own protected area types depending on the circumstance. Ecological or eco parks are very much a brainchild of that. So the ecological parks mirror what the Department of Wildlife Conservation has to offer. At the moment, we have 2 which are open to the general public and a further 3 that are currently being developed for the purposes of ecotourism. They're not open yet. And these ecological parks, although governed under the Forest Conservation Ordinance, are basically there to provide an ecotourism boost, as it were, for the Department of Forest Conservation. So the first of these was opened in 2007-2008, and that's Hurulu. And Hurulu is quite a well-known ecological park now, because Hurulu provides those who are after charismatic fauna, let's say examples of terrestrial big 5, like our Sri Lankan elephant. Hurulu, as an ecological park, is one of the protected areas in which, during both the months of the gathering, as well as more so outside the months of the gathering, when Minneria and Kaudala are relatively free of wild elephant populations, the resident populations in the North Central province tend to gather at Hurulu. And then more recently in 2020, the Galvila Ecological Park was opened in the Puttalam district. Galvila is an interesting one because Galvila sits to the southeast of Wilpattu National Park. And Galvila is not only in the vicinity of Wilpattu National Park, but because of existing protected areas like the Tabboa Wildlife Sanctuary and the Veera Kodicholle National Reserve Forest as well, Galvila actually has a connection to Wilpattu National Park. And again, I'll elaborate on this a bit more as we go on. Then we have the proposed reserves. Now, proposed reserves are significant, particularly for the controversy surrounding relatively unprotected wilderness areas in recent times. I refer to Government Circular number 5 of 2001, Government Circular number 1 of 2020, and the overall controversy that surrounds them. So proposed reserves are identified areas of wilderness which have been proposed by the Department of Forest Conservation, but have not necessarily received an extraordinary gazette solidifying their existence into law. Now, the reason why proposed reserves are important is because they still provide a very basic framework by which unprotected wilderness lands can be turned into protected areas with relative ease. Then after that, we have plantation forests. And I refer back to what I said earlier about how the Department of Forest Conservation's mandate has changed over time. Now, the Department of Forest Conservation obviously still engages in plantation forests. A very good example of this is once you pass the main entrance of Galloa Valley National Park, you pass Inginiagala town, and then you head north towards the Narmal Oya Reservoir. And as you're heading that way, on your left-hand side, just after you leave Inginiagala town, you come across a signboard which says the Narmal Oya Forest Reserve. And that is not a traditional DFC protected area. It's not a traditional national forest reserve because it actually contains 70 to 80% teak, as teak is still very much a very significant plantation component in the dry zone. So although plantation forests are now more so managed by the Ministry of Plantation Industries, the Department of Forest Conservation still has plantation forests under its direct purview. And then we come down to the national man and biosphere reserves. And that's important because unlike their international counterparts, national man and biosphere reserves are simply there to add an extra mandated layer of protection for specifically selected protected areas that are of ecological importance. So the Department of Forest Conservation is actually critical in ensuring that we have a protected area. It's all well and good to say, oh, I went to visit, I went on a safari in Yala National Park. I went on a visit to Wilpattu National Park. Yes, national parks are important. Nobody's doubting that. But without the ecological support and the capacity that protected areas that are not under the Department of Wildlife Conservation provide, it's very difficult to see an ecologically stable future for Sri Lanka's wilderness areas. I saw earlier that Dr. Sumit Pilapitiya had joined us today. And Dr. Pilapitiya and a couple of other senior wild elephant researchers have actually done very significant studies to suggest and to actually prove that just from the standpoint of Sri Lanka's wild elephant population, 60% or more of Sri Lanka's total wild elephant population resides outside national parks specifically. Now, obviously that statistic will change when we talk about the entire protected area. But what's important to understand is that national parks alone are not going to be enough to safeguard Sri Lanka's ecological diversity. Because the Department of Wildlife Conservation, for a start, simply does not have as much land as the Department of Forest Conservation to ensure that it has a protected area network of significant ecological capacity. So just think about that and think about how awareness can be spread about Department of Forest Conservation protected areas and how moving down the line, 10, 20 years down in the future, we will need Department of Forest Conservation protected areas to really fundamentally ensure protection for the overall ecological stability of this marvelous island that we call home. And for reference, these represent the largest Department of Forest Conservation protected areas that we have in Sri Lanka. Most people won't be aware of these protected areas. I think Marvindu saw quite a bit of newsworthy coverage during the previous central government of Sri Lanka, when a certain politician engaged in the cutting and destruction of this particular conservation forest, which sits directly north of and also shares a boundary with Wilpattu National Park. So Marvindu as a conservation forest got a little bit of attention, and it was finally gazetted by the previous then Minister of Mahaveli Development and Environment back in 2017. Other than that, Singaraja is of course fairly well known. Knuckles is relatively well known, but most of these protected areas are fairly, well, they're fairly underwhelming as far as people, as far as the general public is concerned. And again, the general public can't be held accountable for that because the majority of these protected areas are off limits to the general public. These protected areas are there specifically to strengthen the traditional mandate of wildlife conservation and protected area management. But as we move into the future, it's becoming more and more clear that a lot of these protected areas are going to have to face a choice. We're going to have to either open a lot more for the purposes of ecotourism in order to safeguard them, as well as provide community benefits to all the local and rural communities that live bordering these protected areas. Or we're going to have to find some form of alternative by which these protected areas provide us the necessary ecosystem services in which value is actually given to these protected areas as wilderness areas for the ecological diversity. I know that traditional protected area management is still the way to go in a lot of people's eyes, but we are starting to have to evolve away from the traditional aspects of protected area management as we move into the future. So those are the two big ones. We also have protected areas under the Central Environmental Authority. Now, Central Environmental Authority protected areas are again relatively unknown. And this is mostly because these environmental protection areas occupy wilderness lands that might be interpreted as outside the traditional purview of the protected area network. But these are very much protected areas. And they're important because they protect wilderness areas that people might not be aware of, and wilderness areas that are actually in need of protection that can't be traditionally given by protected areas under the Department of Wildlife Conservation and the Department of Forest Conservation. Examples of environmental protection areas include Hantana in the Kandy district, Maragalakanda in the Monaragala district, the buffer zone of the Knuckles Conservation Forest, which is actually its own protected area, an environmental protection area, Bolgoda, which is an environmental protection area, including the area of 1 kilometer demarcated from the boundary of Bolgada Lake itself. Lake Gregory is another environmental protection area in the Norelia district. So environmental protection areas are there basically to fill the gap between traditional conservation needs and non-traditional conservation needs. Then we have protected areas under the Department of Fisheries and Aquatic Resources. Now, although under the Fisheries and Aquatic Resources Act, which is the piece of parliamentary legislation associated with DFA, although fishery reserves are there, the provisions are there for them to be gazetted and have been for the last 30 to 40 years, strangely enough, no fisheries reserves have ever actually been gazetted, which is a bit of a shame because fisheries reserves form a sustainable alternative protected area type in which the fisheries industries are still relatively recognized and managed, because fisheries does contribute a significant percentage of GDP to the country, as well as provide livelihoods for multiple coastal communities. But fisheries reserves also provide areas in which fisheries stocks can recover from fishing activities. So fisheries reserves have to actually be declared in conjunction with the Ministry of Wildlife and Forest Conservation. That's important to know. But strangely enough, no fisheries reserves have ever actually been gazetted. What have been gazetted, though, are managed fisheries areas. Now, these are another type of alternative marine protected area, which provides local communities the ability to engage in sustainable fisheries activities that are managed and controlled within the boundaries of this protected area. But that management has to be done through cooperative and collaborative actions between the Department of Fisheries and Aquatic Resources and local fisheries communities as well. Then we go to the Coast Conservation and Coastal Resources Management Department. Now, CCCRMD is more in the news these days for less than favorable activities affecting the overall stability of the coastline in Sri Lanka. I refer to the Mount Lavinia debacle, where millions of taxpayers' rupees were actually spent on a project that ultimately ended up not providing the required or not achieving the required aims. But nonetheless, the Department of the Coast Conservation and Coastal Resources Management Department does have protected area types under its purview. Of special note are the environmentally sensitive areas. Traditionally, environmentally sensitive areas, which again fall outside the purview of the traditional protected area network, but at the same time do provide an alternative to the Department of Wildlife Conservation, Department of Forest Conservation protected areas. These were traditionally gazetted under the Coast Conservation and Coastal Resources Management Department. Having said that, I do have a piece of good news for everybody who has tuned in today. Recently, the Ministry of Environment did actually release a new national policy document. And this national policy document actually concerns environmentally sensitive areas in Sri Lanka. So although environmentally sensitive areas never had proper definitions, proper demarcations, and a proper set of government documentation that govern what they actually are, this draft version of the National Policy on Environmentally Sensitive Areas was released as early as 7 days ago by the Ministry of Environment. And it now provides a framework by which the environmentally sensitive area types can be used for more comprehensive ecological preservation measures in Sri Lanka. So this draft document is available. If anybody wants it, I'm more than happy to share it with whoever would like to go through it. And because it's in draft version, members of the general public can actually provide their comments to the Ministry of Environment through public consultation meetings. So I just thought I'd share that piece of good news just for everybody who's tuned in today. So going back to the presentation. The Coast Conservation and Coastal Resources Management Department is also important because they have purview over the entire coastline of Sri Lanka. And their coast conservation, especially the coastal conservation reservations, provide an ecological barrier in a landscape that these days is more oriented towards developing the coastlines than actually preserving. Then we move on to more non-traditional protected area types, such as archaeological or ecological reserves. Now, if you recall, I said earlier that protected areas don't necessarily have to just include ecological components. Archaeological, historical, and cultural components can also be included. And that is no less present in the fact that under the Department of Archaeology, we have a protected area type known as an archaeological or ecological reserve. And many of these archaeological and ecological reserves are not only wilderness areas that have significant ecological diversity, but historical and cultural components. And we are an island that is rich in historical and archaeological diversity. And that is why we have archaeological or ecological reserves under the Department of Archaeology. Then we come to what falls outside the protected area. Very much a controversy today. Other state forests and state forested lands, multiple government circulars, a plethora of backward-forward controversy regarding the existing parliamentary legislation, specifically Section 20 of the Forest Conservation Ordinance. Many people will be aware of this. I don't need to delve into this too much. All I will say is that other state forests and state forested lands which are not protected areas are now sadly under the purview of district secretaries and divisional secretaries, which in layman's terms are the implementing arms of the central government of Sri Lanka. And then we have lesser known non-traditional protected area types, such as village forests, of which we've never actually gazetted any into existence, as well as agricultural and environmental tourism zones. So these serve specific purposes. Village forests are meant to provide a non-traditional interpretation of protected areas in which local communities can use concepts of sustainable forestry to harvest the resources they need. And in that light, it actually provides a method by which traditional protected areas can actually be protected, because if rural communities have village forests from which they can engage in sustainable resource extraction and promote sustainable forest types, then that will lessen the burden on traditional protected areas and illicit activities taking place within those protected area types as well. And then agricultural and environmental tourism zones are more born of the need for the subnational or provincial and local elements of government to engage themselves within protected area management in Sri Lanka. So it does get very complicated. But the basic idea is that while there is this huge framework under which protected areas in Sri Lanka fall, and all wilderness areas fall for that matter, understanding it is the first step towards achieving a somewhat coherent and structured approach to the overall management and preservation of wilderness areas in Sri Lanka. So I'll leave it at there for now with regard to the presentation. And I'm just going to move on to a little mapping project that I thought I'd share with everybody today. So obviously, mapping out the entirety of the protected area network in Sri Lanka is quite a significant task. And it does require a certain level of understanding as to what you're dealing with where protected area is concerned. Now, I apologize in advance if this is a bit convoluted, but please understand that engaging in this type of work where protected areas is concerned means you have to look at all aspects of protected areas. You have to look at you have to look at the physical components. You have to look at the ecological diversity. You have to look at the topography. You have to look at the geological features. You have to look at the administrative components. Who is in charge of them? Where are the field officers of the respective government entities? Where do the boundaries lie? Are the boundaries man-made? Are the boundaries natural? There's a lot to think of when we're talking about protected area management in Sri Lanka. So I'll give you an example. So this polygon or shape, the one in light green, which you can see, which extends all the way down here. This represents the new boundary of Singaraja. As I said earlier, Singaraja was quadrupled in size as a result of the 2019 Extraordinary Gazette, which basically provided the final push towards ensuring that Singaraja retains its stability as a protected area. The Department of Forest Conservation has long been in a battle with landowners, regional plantation companies, the private sector, and the general public to actually not gazette, but more so demarcate the full boundaries of Singaraj. And they finally were able to, after 20 years of pushing. They managed to, in consultation with a number of environmental organizations, they managed to actually gazette Singaraj and demarcate it once and for all. Then if we look at a more traditional protected area that everybody might know and love, Udawalawe National Park. But Udawalawe National Park in itself wouldn't be much, because without the protected areas that link Udawalawe to the rest of the protected area network, Udawalawe itself would actually suffer from ecological stagnation. As an example, although traditionally we have interpreted Udawalawe as being a safe haven, a resident haven for about 800 plus wild elephants, if it wasn't for the other protected areas, such as the Dahiagala Wildlife Sanctuary in yellow here, the Vatihirikanda Nature Reserve, the Bogahapalessa Reserved Forest, the Ilukpalessa Reserved Forest, if it wasn't for protected areas like this that actually provided an overarching wilderness structure in which these wild elephants and all sorts of other fauna can actually move back and forth, Udawalawe would have stagnated ecologically by now. In fact, Udawalawe would probably be an ecological dead zone if it wasn't for the rest of these protected areas. And remember that Udawalawe even today is facing an invasive species. I mean, Udawalawe is basically in the middle of a war with invasive species that have basically crippled the food sources for a lot of the charismatic herbivorous megafauna. And that has led to serious health implications for the wildlife populations in Udawalawe. But they still are able to travel to Bogahapalessa, to Lunugambera, to the newly gazetted Hambantota Managed Elephant Reserve, and even as far as Yala National Park, because of the protected areas that we have here. Now, this doesn't just apply to the dry zone. The wet zone itself, even in the montane wet zone, is an ecological treasure trove in terms of protected areas. Let's just take a look at another example that I spoke of earlier, the Knuckles Conservation Forest, which is the blue polygon shape. The Knuckles Conservation Forest is surrounded on two sides, to the west by mixed settlement and agricultural lands, and to the east, as you go down to the intermediate zone and to the dry zone, by the Mahaveli River and the agricultural schemes that happened in the 1970s and 1980s in the overall Mahaveli region. And yet still, the Knuckles Conservation Forest provides a safe haven for forest types that are unlike anything you can imagine in Sri Lanka. And what's interesting about the Knuckles Conservation Forest is it's not only connected to the rest of the Central Highlands by other protected areas like the Victoria Randanigala Ranthambe Wildlife Sanctuary, which is shown here in yellow, but it's also connected to the dry zone, the intermediate zone and the dry zone by means of other state forests like Pallegama Laggala, which is shown here. And it's through Pallegama Laggala that there is what is essentially the last wilderness connection, a land bridge of sorts, another state forest that serves as a land bridge for fauna and flora to travel between the dry zone and the wet zone. And Pallegama Laggala connects the Knuckles to none other than Waskamua National Park, which some of you will know, some of you will have visited and will know is a stunning representation of what's left in the dry zone. As we move further towards the heart of the Mahaveli region, we have protected areas like Angamedilla National Park, which is directly north of Waskamua, Mahaveli Floodplains National Park, which is in blue here, which has suffered, unfortunately, in more recent years due to the intense amount of illicit sand mining and other illegal activities that is taking place within it. Somawatia National Park, which is here in green, the Trikonamadu Nature Reserve in orange, a multitude of DFC protected areas all around. And then as you move further north towards the northern province, you understand that even today, from west to east in the northern province, which was historically known as the Vanni region, that historical Vanni forest region, still from east to west is covered in Department of Forest Conservation protected areas, which contain wilderness lands that we haven't even begun to understand and study. More recently, there was this happened in 2015, but still a piece of good news. Our third largest national park, which is shown in blue here, Madhu Road National Park, was gazetted for the purposes of opening up protected areas in the northern province for the purposes of ecotourism. As we move from Madhu Road into the Mannar district, or shall we say towards Mannar Island, we notice that even along the boundaries of our economic exclusive zone, we have a marine protected area. And this marine protected area highlighted in light blue is Adams Bridge Marine National Park. Adams Bridge Marine National Park has been the center of some of the most incredible resident, migratory, and vagrant examples of avian fauna in Sri Lanka. At the moment, Dr. Sampath Senivaratna and the University of Colombo are actually engaging in prolonged extended studies simply to understand the avifaunal diversity of Adams Bridge Marine National Park. And then we get towards Wilpattu. Wilpattu National Park, as everybody knows, is our largest national park. But more importantly, the historically significant wilderness lands to the north of Wilpattu National Park, which now form, as I told you earlier, the Marvillu Conservation Forest. It's these areas here that not only suffered under the previous central government of Sri Lanka, specifically through the actions of one road minister, but more so than that, for years, in unknown protected areas like this, there have been sadly instances of human encroachment. And it's only through proper dialogue with all sectors of society that issues like this can be rectified. But again, talking about the issues in the Wilpattu area is trivial compared to other examples of deforestation. I think this one is one that I think a lot of people haven't quite understood. This protected area highlighted in light blue is the Wattagama Kabilitta National Reserve Forest. And what you're looking at here, unfortunately, although it's very negative, sadly, is the worst example of protected area deforestation in the country. And this actually happened during the previous iteration of the current government, the current central government. So during the previous iteration, 2005 to 2015. Wattagama Kabilitta is a 293 square kilometer national reserve forest. It borders Yala National Park directly to the north. And it has suffered almost 50,000 acres worth of deforestation over the space of 8 years. And that deforestation is still ongoing as we speak. And I'm not going to go too deeply into this because there have been articles on this and there have been videos that have been released on this, and this has been talked about a little bit. It hasn't nearly been talked about as much as deforestation in Wilpattu, but I just want to highlight one point. The boundary of Wattagama Kabilitta and Yala National Park Block 4 is the Kumbukonoe. And the deforestation in Wattagama Kabilitta is so bad that it has actually reached the Kumbukonoe itself. So there is a very strong chance that if Wattagama Kabilitta is destroyed and if no positive action is taken to educate and make people aware as to what protected areas that are not national parks are, then one day this will spill over into Yala National Park Block 4, and that will be a complete tragedy in itself. So Wattagama Kabilitta is a significant example. Another example is the Kumbukan Conservation Forest, a huge 383 square kilometer conservation forest that links Kumana National Park and the Panama Kudinbigala Wildlife Sanctuary to the south, with Lahugala Kitulana National Park and the Bakmitiya Tibirigola National Reserve Forest to the north. Now it's this contiguity that is important to understand, because in theory, given what we have in terms of protected areas, and this is remarkable to think about, a wild elephant or a leopard, in theory, in Yala National Park Block 1, can cross the Manikga, go via Yala National Park Block 2 and the Yala Strict Nature Reserve, which is a separate protected area type in itself, cross the Kumbukonoe, jump into Kumana National Park, go through the Panama Kudinbigala Wildlife Sanctuary, into the Kumbukan Conservation Forest, into Lahugala Kitulana National Park, continue through Bakmitiya Tibirigola, onto the Galloya Valley region, including into Galloya Valley National Park, via Nelugala, into Madroya National Park, and then carry on via all these Department of Forest Conservation protected areas such as Nuragala, Toppigala, and actually make its way into the Mahaveli region, into Vaskamua, Mahaveli Floodplains National Park, Somoati, and beyond. That contiguousness is something that is not quite understood. Even in the Wilpattu region, or what we describe as the Wilpattu region, because we know Wilpattu so well. From Galvila, the new ecological park, via Veerakodiccholle and Thabbola, wildlife can travel into Wilpattu, into Maavillu, cross over a very narrow strip of unprotected wilderness land into Mother Road National Park, and carry on to the protected areas and unprotected wilderness areas that form the heart of the historical Bunny Forest region, and for the most part are still intact. Towards the Kilinochchi district, there has been a significant clearing of forest lands over the last 40 to 50 years, but for the most part, these wilderness areas remain intact. And these lesser known wilderness areas are important because the whole point of them is to provide an ecological safe haven. Because where ecotourism has basically overwhelmed Yala National Park Block 1, for example, as well as Udawalawe National Park, Mingnaria National Park, Cowdell National Park, even Horton Plains to an extent. Horton Plains is significantly overwhelmed by ecotourism in this day and age. But it's important to understand that these lesser explored wilderness areas are the ones that will eventually provide the safe havens for wildlife and provide a representation and almost a capture in time of what Sri Lanka can continue to look like in this day and age. Now, Waskamua National Park, as I mentioned earlier, is one of these examples, because Waskamua National Park is very much an unexplored wilderness paradise. Most of Waskamua National Park is not accessible, not because it's not accessible in terms of administration, but because it's such a thick, dense, ecologically rich wilderness. There are multiple examples of contiguous vegetation that are found in Waskamua. And Waskamua itself, although it's more openly known for its wild elephant populations in the open plains areas near the main entrance at Handungamu, that is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of what Waskamua is. The same can be said for Galloe Valley National Park. Galloe Valley National Park has an ecological diversity that we still don't fully understand. But what is understood is that Galloe Valley National Park, if developed and administered properly, as a lesser explored wilderness area, can provide an experience that nobody, whether you're local or from overseas, it'll be an experience that will be unlike any other in Sri Lanka. But again, Galloe Valley National Park is a very sensitive set of ecosystems. And those ecosystems need to maintain that ecological stability for the purposes of ensuring that Sri Lanka has a future where unexplored wilderness areas are. And I guess one of the last things that I'm just going to talk about is the fact that even in the Central Highlands of Sri Lanka, Horton Plains National Park, the Peak Wilderness Wildlife Sanctuary, the Ratnagirimale Other State Forest, even the Pidrutalagala Conservation Forest, and all the protected and unprotected wilderness areas that basically surround Morelia town. These are all incredible bastions of what the wet zone, specifically the montane wet zone, has to offer in terms of diversity. Yet sadly, because they're so poorly known, we are seeing examples of significant, potentially catastrophic deforestation happening within these protected areas. And obviously the political motivations behind this are clear. But the pressure that we need to impose from the general public and the support that we need, I still firmly believe that combined with a greater understanding of the lesser known wilderness areas in Sri Lanka, whether they're protected areas or unprotected wildernesses, will take us a long way in ensuring that we have ecological diversity to offer where Sri Lanka is concerned in the future. And there's a lot more to this, there's a lot more to this map. But I hope that people have got a basic understanding of what that ecological diversity means for Sri Lanka's future and what these lesser explored wilderness areas have to offer. Because at the end of the day, if we lose the rest of our unexplored wilderness areas, the lesser known ones, our national parks won't have a future. That's the bottom line. And we can take action here and now to do something for the future of Sri Lanka's lesser known wilderness. I hope what I said was clear today. Thank you again to everybody who has tuned in. I will hand this back to the host now to continue the discussion. But thank you everybody for listening, for taking the time to listen to what I have to say.
Hi, John. Thank you so much for that awesome lecture. Could you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, John.
Okay, so now we move on to the questions. We have quite a lot of questions actually. So we'll try to answer as many as possible. So the first question is, you were speaking about the ecological parks. So someone has asked, what is the difference between ecological parks and national parks?
Okay, good question. Ecological parks, first and foremost, fall under the Department of Forest Conservation, not the Department of Wildlife Conservation. That's the first thing. The second thing is they are governed under the parliamentary legislative and regulatory framework that the Department of Forest Conservation provides. So the rules and regulations governing these ecological parks mean that it might not necessarily be as stringent as what you find in a national park, but you still have to respect and appreciate that the Department of Forest Conservation is fairly new to the ecotourism game, particularly where vehicular safaris and parks are concerned. And as such, these ecological parks are a means by which the Department of Forest Conservation can openly share examples of, especially amongst those who love charismatic fauna, the terrestrial fauna that you wouldn't traditionally see otherwise outside a national park can be found within these ecological parks. So the Department of Forest Conservation is relatively new to that aspect of the ecotourism. Walking and hiking safaris have been happening for years in Kannelia, in Singaraja, in Knuckles, but these vehicular safaris are providing an alternative to more crowded protected areas. Because at the end of the day, whether we like it or not, the majority of the members of the general public will be entering the 7 most well-known national parks in Sri Lanka. Lesser known ones like Madroya, Galloya Valley, Vaskamo, Chundikulam, Madhu Road, Mulugam, just don't get that kind of visitation. But in strategic areas where these more well-known national parks like Wilpattu, Minneri, and Kaudal are concerned, having ecological parks in the vicinity means that you can strike a balance. Instead of overcrowding Department of Wildlife Conservation protected areas, you can now split the ecotourism numbers between the Department of Wildlife Conservation national parks and the Department of Forest Conservation ecological parks. They serve a similar purpose, but they're not exactly the same.
Thank you, John. The second question is, what is the total percentage cover of Sri Lanka that is, given to protected areas? And also another question that is tied to that is, of this area, what is the majority of, or like, what is the forest type that has the largest, percentage cover?
Okay. So to answer that two-pronged question, firstly, again, since there's no compiled data, and since I'm in the process of still compiling that data to form one unified front, at the moment, the estimations lie that about a third of the island, remember, this island is 65,610 square kilometers. So approximately a third of the island, or just under a third, falls under the purview of protected areas, as well as unprotected wilderness areas, or wilderness areas that receive limited legal recognition, such as other state forests, state forested lands, and environmentally sensitive areas. That's the first component. Secondly, to understand the answer to the second question, we have to first realize that the ecological split that Sri Lanka has is between the wet zone, the dry zone, and the intermediate zone. So about 55 to 60% of Sri Lanka is covered by the dry zone. And the dry zone is further divided into 2 subclimatic regions, the semi-arid zone and the arid zone. The wet zone covers about 35 to 38%, and that is further split into the lowland wet zone, the submontane wet zone, the montane wet zone, and the upper montane or cloud zone. And then the balance from those two, including their associated sub-ecological categories, is the intermediate zone, which covers about 2 to 5% of Sri Lanka. Now, the intermediate zone provides a narrow belt, which separates the wet zone and the dry zone, but the dry zone is very much dominant. So in terms of a specific type of contiguous vegetation that provides the majority, although it's not a significant majority, by far, dry zone forest types, whether it's dry zone dry evergreen forests, dry zone riverine forest, decanthon scrub forest, riparian gallery forests, or other associated dry zone forest types, those provide the majority in terms of contiguous vegetation or forest types that we have today in Sri Lanka. But as I said earlier, the ecological laboratory and the diversity is 1,000 times more in the wet zone contiguous vegetation and wet zone forest types. I hope that answers that question.
Thank you, John. That does. So secondly, a lot of people have been asking about the MER. So could you speak a little bit about the MER? Okay, is it a success? And can we apply this concept to other areas in Sri Lanka, like Galgamuwa, for example?
Good question, actually. I know a lot of you have a connection to Galgamuwa, as it were, because Galgamuwa is one of those fragmented, anthropogenically dominated by human landscapes that still contains a significant percentage of elephants, of wild elephants, of Sri Lanka's wild elephant population. I'll come back to that. But regarding the MER, let me first share with you the good news piece of documentation that basically ensures that the MER is in existence. So this is Extraordinary Gazette number 2222-62, dated as Friday, the 9th of April, 2021, which sets out that the MER, after, what are we looking at? 11 years of hard fighting on the conservation community side, the Hambantota Managed Elephant Reserve has been declared as a new protected area type. Here's something to understand for protected areas such as managed elephant reserves. Firstly, they are non-traditional protected area types because managed elephant reserves are supposed to include both private land and state land, much like a wildlife sanctuary, but unlike a wildlife sanctuary, they also provide a regulatory framework by which the human-elephant conflict or the human-wildlife conflict in general is mitigated and actually almost eradicated through proper, organized, coordinated conservation measures. Or at least that was the plan when the current national policy on the management of wild elephants was drafted. I was actually there for the drafting of that plan. But at the moment, the Hambantota Managed Elephant Reserve, for the most part, is very much a component of state land. So it's a protected area that's almost completely under the control of the state, because the national policy on the management of wild elephants was actually significantly modified from the original draft when it was finally released by the Department of Wildlife Conservation in 2018-2019. So managed elephant reserves provide an alternative to more traditional protected area types. And as you can see here, the managed elephant reserve is not only meant to provide an area in which the wild elephant populations of the Hambantota district, which is numbered in at approximately 400 wild elephants, 300 to 400 wild elephants. That's a significant percentage of our total wild elephant population. Within the anthropogenically changing diverse landscape of the Hambantota district, where there are still moderate levels of wilderness left, the managed elephant reserve is supposed to provide a safe haven for that. But as I said earlier, it's also meant to mitigate the worst examples of human-elephant conflict. And the managed elephant reserve actually was designed in a way that it connects to Lunagambera National Park, to Boondala National Park, and even through a proposed corridor to Udawalawe National Park, in order to ensure that there is sufficient ecological movement and that genetic diversity remains high, instead of stagnating the wild elephant population and just simply containing them within the boundaries of the area. Traditional conservation methods like driving populations of wildlife, including wild elephants, into protected areas and sealing them off does not. Simple as that. We've seen that happen before. And when it has happened, a lot of wild elephants have suffered and died due to starvation and due to competition of resources and the inability of protected areas such as national parks to hold such significant wild elephant populations. So the managed elephant reserve provides an alternative type of protected area in which man and nature are supposed to find some form of coexistence. Even if managed elephant reserves now don't incorporate significant amounts of private land and a majority state land, that's fine. At the very least, the declaration of the managed elephant reserve in the Hambantota district will provide a framework and hopefully a regulatory framework once the relevant extraordinary gazette with the regulations on how to manage and effectively run the MEIs released by the Department of Wildlife Conservation, which will hopefully be sooner than later. That will provide an alternative measure by which, in a very human-dominated landscape, the balanced wilderness areas in the Hambantota district can be utilized for the purposes of preserving the Hambantota district's wild elephant population.
Thank you, John. While we're on the topic of elephants, I think you shared a picture of an elephant, and I think you forgot to share the location. A lot of people have been asking, where did you take that?
Yeah. So what have people been saying, Jonathan? Well, has anybody been guessing in terms of on the chat?
No one has been guessing, but they've been asking whereabout was that take.
Okay, no, it's interesting. I'm glad you brought that up again. So I'll go back to the image, right? So this image, and I've had this discussion with a lot of people before. And many people have assumed, because of how close I was to these wild elephants, the openness of the terrain, and the overall relative calm manner of these wild elephants, people assumed this was in one of the national parks. I was given quite a few options, such as Vaskamwa, Kumana. I had somebody say Lunugambera, some who said Yala. There were quite a few options, but nobody actually guessed or understood that this didn't actually take place in a national park. The location for this photograph is the Vatahirakanda Nature Reserve. And I'm going to go back to that. And why I'm going to go back to that is because very few people understand that there is a way by which people can actually access non-publicly accessible protected areas. And this is more against circumstance than anything else. But let me elaborate on it. So Vatahirakanda, the nature reserve that connects, so Vatahirakanda's primary purpose is to serve as a nature reserve. That's its first purpose. But it also has a secondary due purpose as a wild elephant or wildlife corridor, which, as I said earlier, collects Lunugambera National Park to Udawalawe National Park and vice versa. Now, when you're on your travels, you will probably notice that a lot of the time when you're traveling through the country, there will be sections of road that cut through vast wilderness areas. And without realizing it, you are actually traveling, cutting across either protected areas or other state forests. So let me remove the Vatahirakanda polygon to show you what I mean. So when you're traveling towards Buttala, Vallavaya, and on towards the Monoragala district, you'll be traveling on the Gaul Road, the A2 highway. And at one point, you will actually come to a point where you see what almost looks like a checkpoint. And when you cut across that, you're actually driving through the Vatahirakanda Nature Reserve. And then you come out to another checkpoint, you'll see signboards as well, demarcating or denoting that you're cutting through the Vatahirakanda Nature Reserve. So that's on the eastern side of Vatahirakanda. But on the western side as well, you come across a similar circumstance where you cut across the western sector of Vatahirakanda as you head towards Dahiyagala and towards Kalpota town when you're traveling from Udawalawe. And I was approximately here. And the wild elephants that we're talking about were just here. I parked my vehicle on the way to Dahiyagala, and in the evening, I turned the vehicle off, stayed dead quiet, and for my luck, there was a family of wild elephants, an extended family with that massive bull that I showed you earlier, who were preparing to cross from this side of Vatahirakanda across the road and onto the Vatahirakanda-Udawalawe boundary, which is just here. So a lot of the time when you're driving through the island, when you do come across a wilderness area that you're cutting across, keep in mind that it might be a protected area. And if it is a protected area, take every precaution and show every ounce of respect possible for any examples of wildlife you cut across, because these roads that we have built are cutting across their protected areas, not the other way around. So these protected areas, much like Vatahirakanda, need to be respected and acknowledged for what they are. A more well-known example of a road cutting across the protected area is none other than the Buttala-Sella Katragama Road, which cuts across Yala National Park blocks 3, 4, and 5. And actually, to get to the main entrances of Yala National Park's blocks 3, 4, and 5, you actually have to cut across Yala National Park on the Buttala-Sella Katragama Road. So that is why protected areas like Vatahirakanda, when you have them, it is important to have an appreciation for them. And at the same time, if you're lucky enough, like I was that day, you will come across a beautiful sighting like that in a protected area that is not a national park and that is not technically open to the general public. But because by means of the unfortunate circumstance of us having built a road across it, I was able to have a wonderful evening of about 2 hours before sundown with that family of wild elephants. It's one that I will never forget.
Wow, that's awesome. Another question that we got, are there any places outside the well-visited national parks where you could reliably observe leopards and maybe even sloth bear?
Yeah. Again, very difficult in a traditional sense, because when we're talking about ecotourism from a vehicular standpoint, there's one thing that plays into the positives of well-traveled protected areas and goes against or prevents such sightings in less well-known protected areas, and that's habituation. Wildlife habituation is one of the reasons why in Yala National Park, Udualaway National Park, and other well-known protected areas that you can have such good sightings of sloth bear and leopard. But on the other side of things, now keep in mind that habituation means that the definition of habituation stems from how used to the presence of human and human-associated mechanisms an example of wildlife is. So I would say in the most balanced sense, where you might still have a good chance of sighting Sri Lankan leopards and Sri Lankan sloth bear, but at the same time, they're not habituated to the point where they just sit in front of a vehicle like they do in Yala Block 1 and Udualaway. The best examples for that would be Wilpattu National Park, Kumana National Park, Horton Plains National Park to a lesser extent, but Horton Plains is a much more sensitive ecosystem being in the wet zone, so I wouldn't usually recommend that as an option, and Vasgamore National Park. Other less known protected areas such as the Galwila Ecological Park and the Hudulu Ecological Park, they do have leopard and sloth bear populations, but they're virtually impossible to see. So that's why I'm not recommending other protected areas. Truth be told, even in Singaraja, there are leopards in Singaraja. But seeing a lowland rainforest leopard is 1 in a million to see a lowland rainforest leopard. And it's unlikely that you'll see it on a walking or hiking safari. And that's simply due to habituation and also due to the fact that in a rainforest environment, it's much harder to see than in a dry zone environment. An example of charismatic terrestrial big five fauna such as the Sri Lankan.
Thank you, John. The next question is, what is the purpose of strict nature reserves and conservation forests? Is there any reason why these areas are out of bounds to the general public?
Again, it's due to the traditional interpretation. Strict nature reserves and conservation forests are there to provide an ecological safe haven where there is minimal to no human interference, which is beautiful in paper and in theory and on paper, but in practical, in terms of practical sense, it just doesn't work. Vasgamore National Park was actually a strict nature reserve. And I think this is an option I should probably highlight just to understand what I'm talking about. So although we have 3 strict nature reserves today, Yala, Hakkala, and Ritigala, there were 4 originally, 4 strict nature reserves. And one of them was Vasgamore National Park. And Vasgamore National Park, the original boundary of the strict nature reserve for Vasgamore National Park was the Dunuvilla Vava and the Dunuvilla Oya, which is a small stream that connects to the Mahaveli River from Dunuvilla Vava just here. So historically, this entire area that you see currently here, which is devoid of wilderness, was the original boundary of the strict nature reserve. But that didn't last, because the strict nature reserve back then was seen as something that you declare, demarcated, gazetted, then you closed up shop and you left the area and you just let it be. But when the Department of Wildlife Conservation came back 30 years later, they realized that a vast chunk of land had been destroyed in this strict nature reserve. So that is why Vasgamore was actually downgraded to national park status, and the current boundary was reestablished along the Mutiyangana Oya, which also connects to the Mahaveli River as well. So strict nature reserves are there for the purposes of strict ecological preservation. But the reason why we don't have that many is because we've realized that for the most part, although we can maybe have 20% of the total protected area network there for the purposes of pure strict ecological conservation, the majority need to be open to members of the general public for the purposes of livelihood enhancement and ecotourism. Because if rural and local communities don't see value in wilderness areas such as protected areas, other state forests and state forested lands, this type of situation will be the end result at the end of the day.
Thank you, John. Another area that people were asking a lot about was about the Muthurajawala wetland. And so could you just speak a little bit about its importance, and are there any steps being taken to protect it from its current destruction?
Yeah. So Muttarajavela has been in the news more recently, and Muttarajavela itself is a marine protected area. It's a marine protected area that falls within the transitional zone of mangrove, wetland, marshland ecosystems. Now, being in the Gampar district, the Muttarajavela Wildlife Sanctuary has faced quite a bit of pressure from human encroachment. And added to that, the construction of the airport expressway, EO3, didn't really help with the situation at Muttarajavela. Now, being a marine wildlife sanctuary, Muttarajavela's whole purpose is to preserve the last remaining majority wetland, marshland, mangrove ecosystems that are found in the vicinity of the Negombo Lagoon. There's also wilderness areas that surround the Negombo Lagoon that are actually other state forests as well, under the Department of formerly under the Department of Forest Conservation. But the majority of these lands are protected under the Muttarajavela Marine Wildlife Sanctuary. So it's divided into two blocks administratively. And that's because, sadly, there was a bit of an administrative hiccup with Muttarajavela, where the CEA was given a small chunk and the DWC was given the balance larger chunk. And that created quite a few bureaucratic issues. And it's actually those bureaucratic issues, as well as interference from other government entities that are considered more powerful in that sense, that has resulted in so much confusion, corruption, and devastation within the boundaries of the Muttarajavela Wildlife Sanctuary. At the moment, the Ministry of Environment, oddly enough, not the Ministry of Wildlife Resources and Forest Conservation, who should be taking the lead, but the Ministry of Environment instead is taking the lead to try and gather the relevant government entities, cabinet ministries and state ministries, to form a coalition task force by which Muttarajavela's issues can be properly addressed. So that is happening, and there's a chance that Muttarajavela, there's a small chance that it might be upgraded, the entirety, both blocks 1 and 2, absorbed into one and upgraded into a national park. And maybe if ecotourism is more widely known and accepted within the boundaries of Muttarajavela in collaboration with the Department of Wildlife Conservation, this might be a potential solution towards preventing future such devastation within Muttarajavela's boundaries. Now, one thing to note of positivity is that the DWC and the CEA are in the process of finalizing Muttarajavela's demarcation. Muttarajavela, like Singharaj, suffered for years without proper demarcation, but that is currently being addressed. So we are seeing a small ray of hope where Muttarajavela is concerned.
Thank you, John. I think we have time for maybe one more question.
Sure.
So kind of in closing, the last question is, in a small and rapidly urbanizing country, what future does our protected area network have? Is it possible to increase the extent of wilderness area, or is it just going to keep decreasing?
A tricky question. I guess the future is not set in stone, and we don't know where the future will take us, sadly. Having said that, I am personally of the opinion that despite our significant population, the rapidly urbanizing nature of Sri Lanka, we still have hope for our protected area. And not just that, the other state forested lands and environmentally sensitive areas that are not protected areas can all be gazetted, in theory, if the right political will and the right bureaucratic backing is given, to significantly increase the protected area network in Sri Lanka. And in areas where agriculture is becoming untenable, where ecological restoration is very much needed, there is actually scope for the acquisition of land for brand new protected areas. I certainly believe we can strike that ecological balance, ensuring that sustainable development takes place to a significant capacity in Sri Lanka, while at the same time ensuring that our protected area network does not stagnate and does not potentially start decreasing or receding in terms of size and ecological diversity. I personally believe that, but to achieve that will take a significant amount of ecological interest, as well as political will, support from members of the general public, and ensuring that there is proper engagement with the bureaucrats who are in charge of the government entities that have purview and authority over the entire protected area network.
Thank you, John. Just one more question. I think this is quite important. So can private entities create game reserves using abandoned farmlands, etc., and connect it with protected areas? What is the legal aspect for this?
I figured this question would come at some point. Private protected areas in Sri Lanka are a non-existent concept at the moment. I know they work well in Africa because private protected areas, for an example, a private game reserve, in Africa, they have millions of square kilometers worth of land And thereby they can provide private protected areas that surround or border state-owned protected areas, government-owned protected areas, in which management is purely handled by the private sector. And that is slowly becoming more and more of an option. There's no doubt about that. But at the moment, there is no parliamentary legislative framework for private protected areas in Sri Lanka. Now, up until very recently, I myself was very much against private protected areas. I always felt that protected areas were very much the responsibility of the state, and I think they still are very much the responsibility of the state. But given the political situation and given the nature of how politics changes and the demand for land, I'm starting to be more open to the possibility of private protected areas, assuming that a proper legislative and regulatory framework is developed to ensure that they are properly regulated and managed. Then I am starting to become more open to the fact that private protected areas might, I'm not saying they will, but I'm saying they might have a role to play in Sri Lanka 50 years down the line. At the moment, though, I'm still hoping that the state will one day turn around and start accepting its responsibilities to the entire protected area network in Sri Lanka. Because at the end of the day, we do not have the provision for private protected areas in Sri Lanka. We simply don't. We don't have a management provision. We don't have a regulatory provision. We don't have any of that. So I still believe strongly that it's very much the duty of the state to look after the protected areas on behalf of the people of the Democratic Socialist Republic of Sri Lanka. But whether or not these private protected areas, such as private game reserve, play a future down the line, they could. If the private sector is responsible, they might be a fantastic model by which to develop new protected areas. But again, we still need to keep pushing for the state to take responsibility for the entire protected area network, that the central government finally takes its responsibilities seriously and starts protecting the ecological diversity and the overall protected area network of Sri Lanka.
Thank you, John. One last thing, a lot of people have been asking, is your map that you showed, is that available to the general public? Yeah.
So at the moment, it's not. I will be making it publicly accessible through open source at some point, and I hope that a lot of collaborating researchers, scientists, academics, intellectuals, mapping specialists, whoever, I do hope that when I make it open source, that they will be open to collaboration and develop this into a fully fledged map. The reason I haven't made it open source yet is I myself am still in the process of finalizing the map. It's only about 70% complete at the moment. But of course, if anybody wants to get in touch with me to discuss what they saw on the map, I'm more than open to that kind of discussion. And if anybody wants to collaborate from a research and scientific standpoint, I'm more than open to that as well. I will be making it open source, definitely. But I first need to finish mapping out the entirety of the protected area network, because there are so many protected areas in Sri Lanka. So I've managed to map as much as I can within the last year and a half, 2 years, but there's still more work to be done. But once it's done, I will definitely be making it open source in some capacity.
Thank you, John. So we come to the end of yet another very successful and knowledge-filled webinar. We cordially thank John Wilson for spending his valuable time to impart his vast knowledge and enlighten us all on the unexplored wilderness areas in Sri Lanka. We are humbled and extremely honored to have had him speak to us today. I hope that everyone joining gained much knowledge from John's awesome lecture. Now I would like to thank Demo and Jeep Sri Lanka for sponsoring this webinar. We are extremely grateful for their continuous support and generous contribution towards our webinar program. We could not have done it without them. Last but not least, I would like to thank the audience for taking part in this event. We hope that you enjoyed today's session and would join us in our future webinars. Also, a lot of people have been asking whether they could watch the previous lectures that we had. They can be found on the STC Mount YouTube channel, and this webinar will also be uploaded there as soon as possible. So thank you, stay safe, and have an amazing week.
Thank you everybody who joined in. I would just like to have my thanks again to the Wildlife Society of St. Thomas's College, Mount Lavinia, for having me. It was a real pleasure to be here today. Thank you to everybody who tuned in. I hope that it's been a somewhat interactive and somewhat awareness raising session, and I hope sufficient awareness has been raised. And just one thing from my side, I hope that we can use the opportunity that COVID-19 has provided to reset ourselves and fully realize and understand the extent of the unexplored wildernesses, whether they're protected or unprotected, that we have in Sri Lanka. But again, Jonathan, thank you so much to you and the team for having me. And thank you to everybody who tuned in.
Thank you so much.